Okay, well, welcome everybody. I think we'll make a start. Welcome to this IPR lecture. I'm Nick Pearce, I'm the director of the Institute. And this evening, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Roger Farmer. Professor Farmer is a distinguished professor of economics at UCLA. He's also currently a research director, just started the research director at NISA, leading economic research institute, as you know, in London. And he's here this evening and made it here through the sort of floods and inclement weather of the journey from London down to Bath to talk to us about the ideas contained in his new book, Prosperity for All, How to Prevent Financial Crises. And these remain, very big and live and important issues in economic policy making, despite the fact that the financial crisis to many feels as if it's sort of receding. Many of its legacies are still with us, and many of the economic debates about why the crisis happened and how to prevent such crises in the future remain very important issues, both for, not just for academic economists, but also for politicians and policymakers. These are incredibly important questions. And tomorrow we have an autumn statement, the first of the new, if you can call it that, the new Theresa May government. And many of these issues, of course, have implications for how we think about fiscal policy, as well as monetary policy, and how the Bank of England and others do what they do. So it's great to have you here, Professor Farmer. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And there'll be an opportunity, of course, to pose some questions and have a debate at the end of the talk. But welcome, Professor Farmer.
All right, fantastic. So thank you so much for that introduction, Nick. It's a great pleasure to be here through floods and storms. So I'm going to talk about the book, and I'm going to talk about some ideas that are, I think, relatively new in the book. I'm going to talk about how those ideas are connected with the past, but also about what they suggest for what we should be doing in the future. And I'd like to start with the past. So the idea that government should be intervening in the economy in order to maintain a high level of employment is a relatively new idea. Before the publication of a book by John Maynard Keynes in 1936, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, that idea was absent from political discourse. I would say that, and everybody who's looked at the general theory has their own idea of what it says. I'd like to distill what I think are three important ideas in the general theory. And I'm going to talk about how they were forgotten, how they need to be resuscitated, and how I'm going to reinterpret those ideas in a new way. So the first of those ideas is what's sometimes called animal spirits. So what Keynes meant by that is that business confidence, consumer confidence, psychology, if you like, is an important independent driver of recessions, business cycles, and in particular, a major cause of the Great Depression. The second idea that was new and important in Keynes's general theory was the idea of involuntary unemployment. And he had a definition of that in terms of macroeconomics, and in particular looking at the immense misery that was generated in the world after the stock market crash in America in 1929. It was very difficult to think about capitalist economies smoothly functioning and generating the best of all possible worlds for everyone. So he coined the idea that there's something wrong or broken in the labor market. He talked about involuntary unemployment, but he never really reconciled that idea with macroeconomic theory. And I'm going to come back to that point because it was one of the consequences, as a consequence of that, we gave up on Keynesian economics in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the third important idea was that government has a responsibility to do something about it. And in particular, he argued that the way that government could do something about the unemployment problem was through countercyclical fiscal policy. So governments should be spending at a time when there was high unemployment. And that was a very radical idea because at the time, and again now, the predominant view of the public purse was that if you're in a crisis, you need to tighten your belt. So austerity is not a new concept. It was the predominant concept of what was called the Treasury view in the 1920s. And Keynes said no. You know, when times are tough, the government has a responsibility to borrow even more and spend. So I'm going to talk about all three of those ideas. I'm going to try and resuscitate the first two. And the third one, I'm going to give an alternative to. So the ideas that mirror those that come out of the book, Prosperity for All, I'm going to talk again about animal spirits, but being schooled in microeconomics and in the theory of markets, I'm going to try and explain why animal spirits happen and how it can be that rational people, and I'm going to argue that people are rational in the sense that economists have meant that a long time. I'm going to argue how rational people who are trying to make money in markets can somehow miss the fact that markets can go very, very wrong. And I'll be talking about the difference between two different ideas of efficiency, and I'll get to those later in the talk. In particular, I'm going to argue that the financial markets are inefficient in a particular way, and I'm going to explain why. Secondly, I'm going to get to this idea of involuntary unemployment, and I'm going to tell you something which may shock you, but for the last 30 years, 35 years or more, I've been to macroeconomic seminars all over the world, and nowhere in those seminars has anyone talked about involuntary unemployment. So the notion of involuntary unemployment was banished from macroeconomics in the 1970s, and it was replaced with the idea that everybody in the labor market is voluntarily interacting. So essentially, when people become unemployed, they're simply taking a vacation. That clearly is silly, and I'm going to tell you how to reconcile Keynesian ideas with microeconomics in a way that reintroduces the idea that unemployment is a very bad thing, and it's in some sense involuntary. And finally, when I put these two pieces together, when I started working on these ideas about 10 years ago, I thought that what I would be doing was really just making the case for Keynesian economics, and I would be coming in on my white horse, and Paul Krugman would be saying, yes, yes, Farmer's got it right. You know, he's our champion for fiscal policy. But then I realized after I started putting these things together that maybe that wasn't quite right. So I'm going to disagree with that third piece of Keynesian economics, and I'm going to argue that the answer to these questions is not large expansionary fiscal policies, although I don't have anything necessarily against them. I'm going to argue that the problem is in the financial markets, and so is the solution. And I'll talk about what I mean by that later in the talk. So in the book, I talk about two different visions of macroeconomics. And the first is the idea that economies are self-correcting. And economists often begin, the history of our subject begins in 1776 with Adam Smith, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And he introduced the idea of the invisible hand. And that notion was that, I'd say it kind of appears again in the movie Wall Street, in which famously Gordon Gekko says, greed is good. Right? And that notion that individuals trying to do as well for themselves as they possibly can results in the best of all possible worlds socially, that's what I'm going to call classical ideas or classical economics. And it's encompassed, or it's the metaphor for that is an idea that was introduced by a Swedish economist, Wicksell. And he said the economy is like a rocking horse. And it's like a rocking horse which is pummeled by a kid with a stick. And every time, if the kid was to hit the stick onto the rocking horse just once, the rocking horse would rock back and forth, and it would come to rest at a point. But if the kid kept hitting the rocking horse randomly, bang, 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 the rocking horse would follow a pattern that was neither determined by the internal physics of the rocker, nor by the random history of shocks, but by some combination of the two. Importantly, in the rocking horse metaphor, the rocking horse always comes back to the same point. And that idea is, I'm going to call that the notion of a self-stabilizing system. And not only classical economics, but another branch which is sometimes called New Keynesian Economics and has dominated the subject for the last 35 years, both classical and New Keynesian ideas encompass that notion that the economy is like a rocking horse. It's a self-stabilizing system. So if the government didn't do anything, eventually we'd come back to full employment. It might take a little bit longer, but we'd get there, and we're never too far away from it. The other notion, which I actually introduced first in a book I wrote 5 years ago, How the Economy Works, it's an alternative metaphor. And in that metaphor, I want you to think of the economy as like a sailboat on the ocean with a broken rudder. And instead of a kid banging the rocking horse with a stick, think of the wind blowing the boat. And the shocks that hit the economy are things like a hurricane, or an airline pilot strike, or a new trade deal, a new invention. And those shocks that buffet the economy in the windy boat vision can move the boat from one place to another, but there's no force which is returning it to a safe harbor. So you could end up with 5% unemployment in the absence of wind, or you could end up with 25% unemployment. That idea was in the general theory and has been submerged or forgotten for the last, almost half a century. So the two themes that I talked about initially were the theme that the financial markets are volatile and inefficient, and the theme that has something to do with the unemployment rate. And I'm showing you some evidence of that on this picture. So the blue line is the value of the stock market measured in real units, so measured relative to something real, in particular measured relative to wages. And the red line with dots on an inverted scale, so it's going here from 0 to 30, is the unemployment rate. And the data you're looking at is from 1928 up through the beginning of World War II. Actually, it goes beyond that to 1945. And the gray shaded areas are recessions. And recessions, so this is United States data, and recessions are dated by a committee called the NBER Dating Committee. And notice that the Great Depression was actually two recessions, one which began in 1929 and ended in 33, and then another one in 1937. So the economy began to recover, unemployment started to fall, then there was another recession in 1937, but the economy really didn't completely recover until the beginning of World War II. What I want you to take away from that picture is firstly that those two things move very closely together, and secondly that the drop in the stock market preceded the increase in the unemployment rate. And you might think, well, that was just the Great Depression. Nothing like that has happened ever since, and you'd be wrong. So this is data from the Great Recession. These are the same two time series, the same two pieces of data, running from 2000 up here through 2014. And once again, I want you to notice that the drop in the stock market precedes the increase in the unemployment rate. Now, there are two reasons that you might give for that connection. And I have stories for them. So if you look carefully over the whole period from in the whole post-war period, and not just the Depression, you find that there's a technical concept called Granger causality. And what that means is that there's information in the stock market that helps you predict what's going to happen to the unemployment rate. Now, there's two reasons that might be. So the first is that the stock market and unemployment might be like a weather forecast. So you go home tonight, you turn on the news, and the weather forecaster says, sorry, it's going to rain even more tomorrow. So sensibly, you take out your umbrella next morning and you're cautious in where you drive, particularly in the current situation. Now, you say, well, I could just go down to the BBC and tell them, no, don't say that. Say it's going to be sunny. You tell the weather forecaster to say it's going to be sunny. That's not going to change things. Nevertheless, you would find that if you looked at weather forecasts and you looked at weather, that the weather forecast would Granger cause, it would help predict what's going to happen to the weather. That's the traditional view that most people would give, or most economists would give, for the pictures that I've just showed you. That the stock market is like the weather forecast. It contains information on what's going to happen, but somehow changing it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference. I don't think that's the way the world is. So there's a second view of the stock market, which I call the forest fire view. So I've been living in California for 30 years, and we have to worry there about forest fires. So imagine that, that you notice that every time somebody goes into a forest after a long dry period and they drop a cigarette butt on the forest floor, that it starts a forest fire. Now, that's an example where if you were to ban people from smoking in forests, you probably would prevent forest fires. And my view is that the causation that you're seeing in the pictures I'm showing you is that second view. And much of the work I've done for the last 20 years or more is explaining why that might be the case. There's another analogy that I like to think about, which also came from Keynes, about the stock market. He said the stock market is like a beauty contest. But it's not like a beauty contest where the judges are judging how beautiful the contestants are. It's a beauty contest where the judges are judging how beautiful they think the other judges think the contestants are. And he said some people are playing that to the second and third degree. So in other words, some people are playing the stock market. They're judging not only how beautiful they think the other judges think the contestants are, they're trying to guess how beautiful the other judges think the other judges think the other judges think the contestants are. And the analogy there is clear. People who are buying and selling in the asset markets are not concerned about the long-term health of the companies they're buying and selling. They're simply concerned about whether they can offload the stocks at a profit at some point in the future. These two people here are responsible for much of the modern view of economics. Now, sometimes when I give these talks, people ask me, well, is economics a science? And my answer to that question is, well, yes, economics is a science, but it's not an experimental science. And as a consequence, it can go very wrong for long periods of time. We can go off on the wrong track. It's a little bit like a tree in which there are many branches, and only one of them is the right one. And sometimes we have to go a long way along the wrong branch before we come back again. And in my view, economics took the wrong branch in 1955. Now, that happens to be the year I was born, but that's not the reason that it went the wrong way. In 1955, this man, Paul Samuelson, wrote in the third edition of his textbook, he coined a new idea that he called the neoclassical synthesis. And what Samuelson was trying to do was reconcile Keynes's ideas in the general theory with classical ideas of economics. And what Keynes claimed, what Samuelson claimed in his textbook, was that the economy is Keynesian in what he called the short run, but it's classical in the long run. And he said the difference between the short run and the long run had to do with what he called sticky prices. So there was some barrier that prevented prices from adjusting. And because prices were not adjusting quickly, the demand and the supply of all goods, and in particular the demand and the supply of labor, were not equal. And so there could be an excess supply of labor. Too many people would be looking for jobs. But if left to itself, the economy would quickly converge back to what these days we would call the natural rate of unemployment. What I mean by that is when you start really thinking about labor markets, you realize that you wouldn't ever really want to have zero unemployment. And the reason you would never want to have zero unemployment is because people are changing jobs all the time. So imagine that you're getting married and you need to move across the country, or you simply want to go to college or university, or you get divorced and you need to move. So there's always people moving and changing jobs. And as a consequence of that, there'll always be some unemployment. But you don't want either too much unemployment or too little unemployment. So so one way of thinking about what economists call the natural rate of unemployment, it's the Goldilocks level of unemployment, neither too hot nor too cold. So Samuelson has this view that it's just sticky prices, and if you just leave economies, they'll get back to this natural rate. And he was really just adding to the ideas of John Hicks, who was a British economist who helped to really try to translate the Keynes of the general theory into simple equations. And I have a lovely quote at the bottom. Joan Robinson, who was a contemporary of Keynes, referred to this idea as bastard Keynesianism. But bastard Keynesianism is the Keynesianism that we've had, and it's the Keynesianism that now permeates our central banks and treasuries throughout the world. Samuelson was wrong. In my view, recessions are not caused by sticky prices. The idea of calling New Keynesian economics was a master stroke in the sense that it enabled Samuelson to claim the mantle of the general theory. But the ideas that he was promulgating are neither new nor are they Keynesian. So they're not Keynesian because the Keynes of the general theory is the Keynes of the windy boat model, whereas the Keynes that Samuelson embraced was a rocking horse model. And nor are they new. In fact, they're really, if you want to see the nicest description of New Keynesian economics, you should look at David Hume's work in 1749, where he has a lovely essay called Of Money, which describes exactly the kind of dynamics that economies follow that are encapsulated in modern New Keynesian views. And again, this brings me back to a point I made slightly earlier. In these descriptions of the world that central bankers and treasury officials and practicing economists and academic economists have been using, there is no unemployment. And so what happens is prices may be slightly wrong, but nevertheless, anybody who wants a job can find a job at the relevant wage in the models that people have been using. Famously, an economist at MIT, Franco Modigliani, resisted that idea. He said that he didn't think the Great Depression was a sudden attack of contagious laziness. And nevertheless, that idea is what's been it's what underlies the models that I've been critical of. All right. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk about two ideas. And again, being trained in classical economics, I'm very resistant to the idea of telling you that government should be in your lives. I was brought up as a good liberal in the English sense of the word, and I think that we all have personal responsibilities to make our own minds up, and I very much hesitate telling governments that they should be in there doing anything. So when I tell you that I think governments should be in there doing something, I feel that I have to tell you why. So I have to explain to you what's going wrong with the world as it's seen through classical economics. Now, classical economics, as it's taught to graduate students throughout the world, is encapsulated in what are called the welfare theorems of economics. And what the welfare theorems tell you is that under some circumstances, if societies of freely interacting people are able to buy and sell things without intervention, that the outcome is, in a fairly narrow sense, but a sense nevertheless, optimal. And that notion of optimality is called Pareto optimality. And what it means is the following. It means that there's really no way that we could divide up the goods in society without making, there's no way we could divide up all of the goods that we have in society and improve the welfare of somebody without making someone else worse off. Now that's a very weak concept, and here's the sense in which it's very weak. Imagine I'm the dictator and I own everything, and you guys are all starving. Well, that's Pareto optimal. It's Pareto optimal because as a selfish dictator, I have no desire for you guys to live or, the starving children to be given anything. And that's an assumption. That's one of the assumptions that underlies classical economics. So I'm not telling you that's my view of humanity. It's not. But, that's one allocation that would be Pareto optimal. Now here's another one. Suppose that we divided up all the goods in the world and you all had equal shares in some way. Well, that could be Pareto optimal. Here's where it wouldn't be Pareto optimal. So supposing one of you is a teetotaler and gets a case of Chardonnay, and someone else is a vegetarian and gets a side of beef. Well, that's clearly not an optimal allocation because the teetotaler doesn't want the case of Chardonnay and the vegetarian doesn't want the beef. So what Pareto optimality says is that kind of thing won't happen in markets. And it's really quite a weak efficiency concept. Now, Keynes looks at what happened in the Great Depression in the 1930s, where unemployment went up to 25% in the United States. And if he were alive today, he would be looking at Greece, where youth unemployment went up to 50%. And he would say, well, that's kind of hard to think about that as Pareto optimal. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that the allocations you see in financial markets are not Pareto optimal. And I'm going to have to tell you why that's the case. And I'll get there in a second. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that labor markets don't work well. And one of the reasons that people gave up on Keynesian economics in the 1970s and the 1980s was as a consequence of something that we call the Great Stagflation. So those of you who lived through it, in the 1970s, we had very high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And the interpretations of Keynes that Samuelson had given didn't allow for that to happen. And one of the reasons is that although Keynes was a wonderful economist and a very intelligent man, he wrote the general theory quickly in an attempt to persuade politicians to do something that he thought would improve the situation. And as a consequence, it's a terrible book to read, There are lots of pieces where people disagree about what he's actually saying. And he never really filled in the piece about what was going wrong in labor markets. And when you fill that piece in, and that's one of the things I've done in this book, you end up with an explanation of why labor markets are not working well. And I'll say a little bit about that. So here's my first piece of evidence about the financial markets. And what you're looking at here are data from 1890 through 2014. Again, the gray bars are recessions in the United States. So this is again US data. And what you're looking at is what's called the cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio. What that is, it's the ratio of the stock market to the value of the stream of earnings that the stocks generate. Now, I have no beef with the idea that the stock market should be volatile. Just think about why. So if you think about the railroad boom in the 1890s, if you think about electrification in the 1920s, if you think about the internet in the last couple of decades, they're all huge, tremendous innovations that ought to lead to tremendous growth, and they did, and therefore to huge value in the ideas and the machines and the capital of the people who introduced those innovations. But although it's true that they should have led to huge increases in the prices of railroads or the prices of electric companies or Apple computers, they should not have led to huge changes in the ratio of the value of the company to the earnings that they would be receiving. Because the reason that Apple computer has value, the reason that railroad stocks had value in the 1890s, and the value that utility companies had in the 1920s was precisely because they were expected to generate big streams of profits. And if you look at simple economic models, they tell you that the thing that you're looking at here should be a flat line. That is, we should see volatility in stocks, but only to the extent that it's generated by volatility in earnings. And when you put the ratio of one to the other, you should get something that doesn't move much. What we actually saw was that in 1920, the price-earnings ratio was low as 5, and in the late 1990s, it was as high as 45. And those are tremendously difficult things to explain using standard economics. So, why did that happen? Well, it's important to distinguish two ideas in financial economics. Some of you will have heard of something called the efficient markets hypothesis. This is an idea that was introduced in Chicago, and the efficient markets hypothesis says that it's difficult or impossible to make money by buying and selling stocks in the financial markets unless you have inside information. Gene Fama, F-A-M-A, who introduced that idea in Chicago, was a stroke of sheer genius, to use the word efficiency. Because what he means by the efficient markets hypothesis has nothing to do with the efficiency concept that I just talked about, and which most economists mean when they talk about efficiency. What Gene Fama meant is what he called informational efficiency. And informational efficiency is simply defined as the inability to make money when you trade in financial markets. That, I think, is probably a pretty good description of the way the world is. If that was not a good description, I would be out buying and selling stocks right now using my knowledge as an economist. As we all know, the knowledge of economists is not worth much. The other idea of efficiency is Pareto efficiency. And Pareto efficiency, when applied to the financial markets, says that there's no way that government could be in there doing anything that would improve the lives of some people without making other people worse off. And I called this book Prosperity for All because I think that idea is wrong. I think there is something that the government can do in financial markets, and I think I know what it is and why it's there. And the answer is the Grim Reaper. When markets go up and markets go down, that influences not only you and I, it influences our children and it influences our grandchildren. So the typical duration of the effects of a financial crisis like the one we've just been through can be 20 years or more. Now, imagine that there was some big market at the beginning of time where everybody who would ever be born could all get together and trade with each other. So for those of you who've studied philosophy, this is a bit like John Rawls's idea of the veil of ignorance. He talks about people doing this. That idea of people trading in financial markets before they're born may seem far-fetched, but it's the idea that underlies the concept of that markets are financially and Pareto efficient that underlies this Chicago doctrine. So in order to believe that financial markets are doing everything that, that markets are supposed to do, you have to believe that everybody could be trading in them. And implicitly, when Chicago economists say you shouldn't be intervening in the financial markets, just let people do what they do because then we'll all be better off, they're implicitly assuming that everybody who will ever be born can be trading in these markets. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because if your first job occurs in the middle of a deep recession, you'll find that you could earn somewhere from 15 to 20% less in real terms over your lifetime than if you're born into a period, or if your first job occurs in a boom. So there are big effects of recessions on people's lives. Now imagine that you really could, for yourself, say to yourself, well, I'm going to let you go back and trade assets before you're born. In one state of the world, you could be born into the Great Depression. In the other, you might be born into the 1960s. What would you like to do about that? And most of us would say to ourselves, or I believe, we'd say, well, I'd like to sell an asset that pays off in the good state, and I'd like to insure myself if I'm born into the Depression so that I don't live a life of misery. Now, those markets don't exist. But it's the assumption that they do exist that leads classical economics to predict that this picture should be a flat line instead of the volatile series I'm showing you. So the idea that there are no prenatal asset markets is the first argument I make in the book for why governments should be intervening in markets. And the reason is because they can buy and sell the assets that our children and our grandchildren are unable to do, and they can stabilize the volatility in financial markets that, in my view, is coming simply from the animal spirits or the exuberance of investors. Here's the second idea. You might say, well, that's enough on its own. You've explained to me why financial markets are volatile. You've explained why it's a bad thing. Why do I need to say anything about labor markets? Well, the answer to that is that if labor markets work the way that economists now say they do, which is that there's no involuntary unemployment, those big swings in the asset markets that we see would simply lead to redistribution of resources between the owners of labor and the owners of capital. So in some periods, wages would be high. In other periods, profits would be high. And we see employment, you'd be able to get a job. It's simply that it wouldn't be worth as much. Now, what we actually see are big swings in unemployment. And the reason for that is that the unemployment, the labor market, is not like a fish market. You don't go down there and buy and sell fish, and at the end of the day, the price comes down, so all the fish is gone. The labor market is what economists call a search market. So imagine that a brain surgeon likes the Rolling Stones. And the brain surgeon wants to go see the Rolling Stones in concert, but to do that, she needs to go down and stand in a queue for 5 hours to get a ticket. So instead, the brain surgeon takes her teenage son and pays him to go and stand in the queue and buy the ticket. Now, that would be an efficient allocation of resources. The brain surgeon can concentrate on what she does best, saving lives. The teenage son makes a little extra money by standing in the queue, and everything works well. Well, that's also not how labor markets work, because there are no markets to pay someone for you to go and take job interviews for you. So in particular, this process of matching people with jobs has two inputs. It has the people searching for jobs, the unemployed people, and it has the recruiters on the side of firms who are looking to hire people. And there are no prices for those two separate inputs. And as a consequence, for there not being enough prices, they're what economists would say are missing markets. And what I've shown in my work, and I talk about in the book, is that that can lead to situations where you could have very high unemployment or very low unemployment, and they're both situations that could persist potentially forever as what we would call equilibrium situations. Where's my evidence, you may say, for this? So I talked about the rocking horse model, and I talked about the windy boat model, and what I'm showing you in this picture is how a new Keynesian model or a classical model or a rocking horse model would respond to a shock. So imagine that what I'm plotting here is GDP per person, and it's growing at 3% or some rate, 2%, and then there's a shock. Maybe there's a presidential election and an unusual outcome. Right? So as a consequence, the economy tanks. But then, after a while, it comes back up to the growth path. Actually, you should think of this as the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. And this is what the new Keynesian model would predict should happen following the collapse of Lehman Brothers. This is the alternative prediction of a windy boat model. Right? So the windy boat model says, in response to the crash of Lehman Brothers, the economy will fall, but instead of returning to the original growth path, you could end up with a path where GDP per person is forever lower than it might have been. And this gap is represented by people who are either out of the labor market or unemployed. They'd love to have a job, but the economy doesn't get you back to the natural rate of unemployment. So you look at those two pictures and you say, well, why am I so confident that the windy boat model is the right one as opposed to the rocking horse model? And here's the answer to that. This is a picture from actual data. So here you're looking at the log of real GDP per person. This is the Great Recession, and this is what happened. Right, so it's because I think that looks a lot more like the second picture than the first. So in America, there's a saying, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. That's what we call scientific evidence in economics. So in the last slide or two, before I open it up to questions, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think a recommendation would be for how we should move forward. So if you accept this idea that these swings in asset markets are Pareto inefficient, and you accept that government has the ability to trade on behalf of our children and our grandchildren, how should they do that? Well, I would like to see something like an institution, something like a central bank, and I think a good institution in the UK to do this would be the newly constituted Financial Policy Committee. And I have a proposal for what the Financial Policy Committee should be doing. They should be stabilizing the stock market. And in particular, rather than buy and sell individual stocks, what I've proposed is that the Treasury or the government or politicians should first of all define the object that should be stabilized. And what I've recommended is something called an exchange-traded fund, defined over the entire stock market and value-weighted, preferably with non-voting shares. So any company that's traded on the stock market would be a part of this indexed fund, and the Treasury Committee or the institution that was running or trading this fund would say next month they would meet, perhaps in tandem with the Monetary Policy Committee, and whereas the Monetary Policy Committee would be charged with maintaining a low and stable inflation rate, the Financial Policy Committee would be charged with maintaining an optimal unemployment rate. What's that, you say? Well, that would be something that would be a decision made by the members of the committee. And if they deemed that unemployment was currently too high, they would say, well, this ETF, exchange-traded fund, which is currently trading at 100, as of next Thursday will be trading at 120, for example. And it will be growing, its price value will be growing over the next 3 months at a rate of 2%, for example. They would then actively trade the ETF in exchange for gilts, and they would do this in order to maintain that price. Now you, as an investor, those of you who work for Goldman Sachs, I see lots of you in the audience here today, you would then say, well, this object's, the government will be offering 120 for this next Thursday, so you would go out and you would buy up the shares that are part of this index and in order to make a profit. So long before Thursday comes around, the ETF will be trading at 120, possibly without any active intervention on the part of the committee. If this has a downside in the sense that it's possible for the stock market not just to be undervalued, but also to be overvalued. And if the committee judges that the unemployment rate is currently too low, that the economy is overheating in some sense, they will then lower the price of the ETF, and they say we will be prepared to short sell these shares or offload them in order to bring the value of the stock market down. And if this were to be a successful policy, I would imagine that the average return to owning equities over the whole market, which is currently about 6% higher than the return to holding gilts, would fall, and the real return to holding gilts would rise until the two met somewhere in the middle at roughly the growth rate of the economy. And once that had been achieved, buying the entire market would be no riskier than simply buying government bonds. However, if you wanted risk, you'd simply go out and buy Apple Computers or British Telecom or whatever you'd like to trade in order to move the resources from one industry to another. So that pretty much is where I'm going to leave it for questions. And I would think very seriously about that idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Farmer. Incredibly interesting. I want to just start with a question, then I'll open up to the floor. The role of housing markets and housing assets in your model. Obviously, big housing bubbles predated the great financial crisis. How do you capture those and stabilise those in the model you've just described?
A fantastic question. So you have to realize that I've been an exile now for 30 years, and in America, stock market assets, if you think about what wealth is in the economy, wealth consists of the value of all the factories and machines and the land in the economy, plus the value of the houses, residential wealth. In America, roughly 2/3 of wealth is in the stock market, roughly 1/3 is in the form of housing. In England, it's reversed. In Great Britain, it's roughly 2/3 in housing and roughly 1/3 in the stock market. So that's an incredibly good question. I'd like to see the way that housing is financed revised. So to put that in context, at Stanford University, new faculty members at Stanford University, because houses are so expensive in Palo Alto, they have the option of having a shared equity contract with the university. So in other words, you only own half your house, the university owns the other half, and then when you come to sell it, the university takes half the gains or half the losses. I would like to see that kind of contract introduced in the UK. I know that at low-income housing, some of those contracts already exist. And you could imagine then developing a market in which equity shares in houses are also traded, and that would give one the ability not only to try to stabilize the prices of factories and machines, those assets, but also the bubbles and crashes that you're seeing in housing markets. There's also a lot more reform, I think, that needs to take place in UK housing before we get there. But don't start me on that. That's another. Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's open it up then. So, gentlemen, here you go.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
So, I mean, you talk about the way I understand at least. No, I don't need to dive.
No, recording.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hello again. So, according to my understanding, you talked about direct intervention in financial markets.
Yes.
So the government reshuffles assets in a way and produces a better argument, a better allocation.
Yes.
My question is very, very simple. There is a large literature, you know this better than me, on complete markets and constraints optimality that, you know, this argument has been formalized in a very nice way about direct intervention in financial markets and, you know, that is good to do it. And basically, I agree, but is this a new idea or a truly new idea, or maybe your idea differs from what I've
The idea that I'm talking about first emerged at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1980s, 1983, and it emerged in economic theory by two economists. I was a young assistant professor at the time, and two people called Dave Cass and Carl Schell wrote a paper called Do Sunspots Matter? And what they meant in that paper was, can non-fundamental events, animal spirits, influence financial markets? And they were the first people to talk about the argument that I'm raising here. And in particular, they distinguished between what they call complete markets, meaning that everyone who's alive today could trade any asset contingent on any event that people might think might occur anywhere in the future. That's called complete markets. And what they called complete participation in markets. And complete participation meant that the unborn are unable to trade. And I'm simply translating that into an updated version, and I think arguing that it's the world we live in.
But don't you need big class of contracts for the government to trade for the unborn, right? So,
well,
I mean, the implementation is hardly obvious, right?
First of all, let me go on and say that, you know, although all the theoretical work I've done assumes complete markets, that in itself is also nonsense. I mean, to think that you could trade a loaf of bread in Paris next year in the event that it's sunny, in return for a sheep in Scotland in the event that it's raining is just absent. So I think the problem is even deeper than incomplete participation. There are other problems that involve incomplete markets. Do I think that it would be Pareto improving for government to intervene and stabilize asset markets? That is, will we have prosperity for all? I think the answer to that is yes. I think that events like the 2008 recession are preventable and should be prevented.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to think how to phrase the question. I'm just wondering how because obviously you're focusing on equity markets here, and I'm just wondering how your view fits in with what's already happened since the boom and the crash, in the sense that there is a view that probably monetary policy perhaps should have been more interventionist before the crisis, and since the crisis we've had macroprudential policy. We've got counter-cyclical capital ratios, changes in the LTVs and the housing market. So are you broadly in favour of that, saying we need this as well, this is another arm of policy, or are you saying more than that? Are you saying that without this new intervention in equity markets, the new regime will not prevent another crash? I mean, because essentially policies focus on the banking sectors.
So Willem Buiter has distinguished what he calls qualitative easing from quantitative easing. So two things happened after 2008. One was a massive increase in the size of central bank balance sheets, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Fed. The other was a distinction in the kinds of assets that they bought. So the Fed intervened by buying mortgage-backed securities. The Bank of England started to buy riskier assets, and what appears to have been one of the most successful interventions on the part of the Bank of England was the banks that were being bailed out at the time held large numbers of unidentifiable so-called toxic assets. And what the Bank of England said, or the Treasury said at the time, was we're going to guarantee the prices of those assets. And that intervention in itself stabilized the markets overnight. So the kind of policy that I'm advocating here has already been tried. I think that's my understanding of what was happening in the Treasury intervention. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority during the Asian financial crisis intervened in the stock market in a spectacularly successful way that made money for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. So there are certainly precursors of what I'm talking about. I'm arguing that what Buiter has called qualitative easing, which is a change in the risk composition of balance sheets, is something that should be made permanent moving forward. And it doesn't have to be the equity markets. In the esoteric world of economic theory, people trade something called arrow securities, which are simply amalgams of different kinds of assets. So the basic idea is to try and reintroduce some stability into those markets.
This question on the price-earnings ratio and why we'd expect it to be stable, because the earnings element is a current year earnings, isn't it?
Well, actually, it's in what I showed you, it's a moving average of the last 20 years. Okay. So that's why it's called the cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio.
Because the price to me would be would incorporate the future.
Yeah,
so
it's certainly possible that you could see. Yeah. If your view was that much of the problem is you would have to assume that much of those fluctuations are coming from simply inability to correctly forecast the future, and whereas I completely recognize that we have a lot of difficulty predicting the future, and many of the events that we're trying to predict are just unknowable, I still find it difficult to think that moving from 5 to 50 is the easily understood in those terms.
Roger, I really enjoyed that. I want to shift to the labour markets, if I may. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the fundamental problems we have now is not that we're not approaching historical full employment as we used to know it in the 50s and 60s, but it's the quality of the work, it's the quality of the jobs. And that seems to me to be a huge problem in terms of productivity, but in terms also of income. And I don't think those two necessarily always go together either. So I'd just like you to comment on that in the light of your analysis here.
You're leading me astray from the themes of the book, but I'm happy to be led astray. We're seeing all the issues that you're talking about are the reasons that Brexit occurred and the reason that Trump was elected in America. So economists have been preaching, and I use the word preaching advisedly, for a long time about the gains from trade and the gains from globalization. And whereas it's patently true that when countries open up for trade, both countries benefit, those gains have not been distributed in Western democracies to large groups of working class and middle class voters. So what globalization has done is lifted 1.5 billion Chinese out of poverty. It's been incredibly fruitful and productive for those of us who own either physical or human capital. The so-called London bubble or the coastal bubbles in America, but the blue-collar workers and people who are less skilled have clearly lost out to that. And I think that unless we find ways of correcting that soon, very bad things are in our future.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the optimal rate of unemployment might be in relation to a couple of things. So one...
5%.
Well, so the first point I'd say is that, I mean, by my understanding of what unemployment is, all of it is involuntary. So when you said that we want some unemployment because people would be moving between jobs, that wouldn't necessarily be my understanding of what unemployment is. In the sense that, I mean, if you move from one job to the other, you don't necessarily claim unemployment benefits, you just move from one job to the other. The other point would be about comparing different levels of unemployment in different countries. So even before the crash, Spain probably had an unemployment rate of, say, I don't know, 8, 9, 10% or something, whereas other countries would have had lower than 5%. So how would policymakers decide whether to deflate or inflate based on the unemployment?
That's a great question. So, and it's one I address in the book. So there are reasons for differences in unemployment rates across countries. So Spanish unemployment is at 18% now. French unemployment, I believe, is around 10. I may have got that a little wrong on one side or the other. One of the main reasons for differences in unemployment rates across countries has to do with labour market institutions. So Spanish unemployment has traditionally been very high because it was very hard, it's less hard but still hard to fire people in Spain. So as a consequence, a lot of people had temporary jobs, firms weren't willing to hire people. Labour economists would call that structural, a structural reason for there being unemployment. But even if you compare countries, imagine that for structural reasons, and that may or may not be efficient, for structural reasons across countries, some countries have higher unemployment rates than others. However, over the business cycle, those unemployment rates across countries go up and down. And it's that second issue I'm addressing, not the first. I do think that those people who are advocating labour market reforms have something to say when it comes to thinking about the first set of issues. And I also think the questions that were raised by this gentleman over globalization have something to say about those sorts of issues. So I'm thinking purely here about one problem, and that's variations in unemployment due to financial cycles. If you correct that, there's still work to be done in thinking about mobility. There are also regional issues to think about here. Economists completely give up on regional issues. We say, well, don't worry about the coal miners, they can just move to London. Right? And we forget that people become attached to the locality they're working in, And I think we need to think much harder about issues like regional policy in order to redistribute the gains from trade.
Hi, I just want to understand your argument a bit better. So let's say, for example, before the crisis, so there's an asset market bubble, so the asset prices are superficially high, and then the crash happens. So from what I understand, the government intervenes and stabilizes the asset market. But supposedly the asset market should be, or the asset prices should not be trading at the price which they were trading at in the bubble environment. So my question is, so how does this transition happen with the government intervening at the same time, stabilizing the asset prices at a level which is somewhere close to the bubble level?
So you're coming from the rocking horse view of the world, where there's a unique fundamental value for the asset markets.
Yes,
I'm coming from the windy boat view of the world, where there's a continuum of possible values for the asset markets. And once you think about animal spirits or beliefs as fundamental, and I argue that's what we should be doing, then different values of beliefs, mass psychology, influences what happens and influences unemployment rates. So I'm essentially arguing that we need to intervene in a way that coordinates beliefs and expectations on a good equilibrium outcome as opposed to a bad equilibrium outcome.
So in this case, so can I say that the supposedly superficially high asset prices could very well be fundamentally consistent with the government is trying to stabilize? Will that be correct, or?
It's not asset prices, it's price-earnings ratios. So imagine that you're told that there's a natural real interest rate and it's 3%, for example. That could be consistent with an asset price of 10 and earnings of 5, or an asset price of 20 and earnings of 10. They're both the same ratio. However, the earnings of 5 might be associated with unemployment of 10%, and the earnings of 10 might be associated with unemployment of 3%. So in this world, there may well be some correct price-dividends ratio, but remember, the dividend is a flow. It's associated with unemployment rates, and the asset value is a stock. I don't know if that helped, and it probably just confused the hell out of everyone else in the room, but
No, that's fine. Thank you.
A question about cycles and waves. So you had on one of your graphs, you had the dot-com bubble bursting, but only a very small increase in unemployment.
yeah.
I suppose my question is just to ask about, lots of economists think in terms of waves, and cycles within waves, and that you get bubbles because you get the deployment of a particular kind of technology across across the economy. You talked about that earlier, the railroads, technology stocks, and so on. And so, fundamentally, sorry,
I didn't mean to interrupt. So let me let you finish.
So I'm asking you about how you distinguish between crashes, recessions that are caused fundamentally by in the kind of wave theory by bubble behavior that follows the deployment of a particular technology, and smaller movements which aren't of that fundamental kind within a wave, but are nonetheless may cause a decline in the stock market.
So technically, I'm going to give a technical answer. So, I mean, the answer has to do not so much with the cause of the movements, and I've emphasized causes that are generated by animal spirits. It's possible, I think, also when you recognize the problems with labor markets, for technological shocks also to have persistent deleterious effects on unemployment. What's important not so much is the cause, it's the persistence. So I think Paul Samuelson was famously quoted as saying that the stock market has predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. And that's true to a certain extent. What you find in data is that large movements in the stock market that are temporary and last for less than 3 months don't have much effect at all. So the 1987 crash, which was the largest one-day stock market crash in American history, had no effect on the real economy at all. It didn't have an effect because Greenspan, who was chair of the Fed at the time, stepped in, massively flooded the system with liquidity, and within 6 months the market was back up above where it would have been, actually less than that, within 3 months. So that's an example of a temporary change. It's when changes are persistent, and the way that that shows up in the data is that, again, I'm going to get into technical language, but you find the unemployment rate and the stock market are what we call random walks, pretty much. They're very, very close, highly persistent, but they're what we call co-integrated random walks. So the way to think about that is the stock market and the unemployment rate are like two drunks walking down the street tied together with a rope. And they can get apart from each other temporarily, but they can never get too far apart from each other. The economics of that is, imagine that you're a retired couple and you have pension assets and you don't really look at the stock market every day, and the stock market falls 20% and you don't really worry about it, and then 6 months later you noticed, oh my goodness, the stock market's fallen by 20% and it's still down. Maybe I won't take that cruise, or maybe I won't invest in my grandchild's education that I was going to do. So it's persistent movements that are causing real effects. And I think the channel is precisely through demand. And the difference, what makes me different from Keynes, is Keynes thought that consumption, which is roughly 2/3 of the economy, was moved up and down with income. And what we found in the 50s and 60s is that consumption moves up and down not with income but with wealth, and in particular at low frequencies. And so by low frequency I mean something that's persisted for a long time. That word low frequency is a word that crept into economics from physics, where I'm using technical terms when not everyone is going to understand them, so I apologize for that.
Okay, have we got any final questions? One more. Yeah, one more, yeah.
Well, just one to the title of your book, Prosperity for All. By prosperity, do you mean employment for all, or 95%? But you're not
only if you like it.
Yeah, but you're not focused on distribution and wealth gaps, inequality.
No. So one of an early chapter in the book, I distinguish exactly those two issues. I think that distribution is incredibly important. It was raised earlier in the globalization question. That's for my next book.
We look forward to reading that and hearing about it too. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Farmer. Thank you. Thank you for coming all this way. Thanks so much indeed. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming, and do look out for future events. Our next IPR event is on the 28th. We have the Cabinet Office Policy Lab coming here in the afternoon. If you want to come along and listen to them, please do.
Let me say that
Yes.
my publisher, Kate, over here, has copies of the book. If you would like to buy one for the very reasonable price of £10 tonight,
£10
special
only tonight.
price, the price of 2 premium beers, and I'd be happy to sign them if you would like one.
Fantastic.